Hello and welcome to Business Talk, brought to you by the Sharonville Chamber of Commerce. I'm Britt Scarce with Emory Federal Credit Union. I'm your host, and today here in studio we have Karl Ulrich with Sibley, Shillitoe & Dyer and Pandy Pridemore from The Human Resource USA, here to talk to us about 1099 contractors. Pandy, Karl.
Hello, Britt.
Hi, Britt.
Guys, Happy New Year and all that.
Thank you. You too.
Yeah. So, is there such a thing as a 1099 employee?
Wow.
We haven't heard that one before, have we?
That's a common phrase used, and it's exactly wrong. You hear that a lot, and it doesn't exist. 1099 contractor or 1099 employee is a contradiction in terms. 1099 employee is you can't use a 1099, which is basically a tax form that you fill out that doesn't deduct taxes, doesn't talk about Social Security. You can't use that form of payment and tax recording with an employee, because an employee, you have to do deductions, you have to do withholding, you have to pay Social Security. So a 1099 form
Workers'
is
comp.
Yeah, all kinds of other things. So 1099 employee is really just a contradiction. That's a common misperception. We talk about 1099 contractors and we talk about W-2 employees, and that's the distinction we want to make clear.
All right. So when is it appropriate to hire someone as an employee versus contracting them as a 1099 contractor?
Yeah, I think the key difference I like to point out between an employee and a contractor is a contractor is basically an arm's length deal for a particular project or service. I'm hiring somebody to paint my house, or I'm hiring somebody to fix my car. An employee is kind of an open-ended, ongoing relationship where you supervise and control a person, you assign duties, you supervise and evaluate their performance, you provide them a salary over time, and you may work on one project one day and another project next day, but it's an ongoing relationship between the employer and the employee, and so that's a much more controlled environment. You're involved in training oftentimes. The other deal is just an arm's length, one project, one service, one type of closed-ended deal, essentially.
Okay. Now, Pandy, are you ever seeing folks kind of pushing the envelope on this and, treating people that are supposed to be contractors more like employees?
How many days of the week do we have? and the really sad part is that when I run into it, it's these individuals or these companies that decide, well, we're just going to try them on a 1099 for a while until we decide whether we want to hire them or not. Or, well, this individual wants to stay independent, so we're going to just pay them as a 1099. And getting back to all the major points that Karl just mentioned, the employer doesn't get a choice in this. And maybe that's something else that we need to mention here. These are not decisions that are made by the employer. These are decisions that are made by the IRS and the Department of Labor that oversees the Division of Wage and Hour. So these are firm, etched in stone guidelines that cannot be breached, and I'm seeing it all the time.
Or by employees, for that matter.
There you go.
Employee can't come in and say, I want to be a 1099 contractor because I don't want you to withhold payroll taxes from my paycheck, and I get a little more flexibility from a tax perspective. Can't do that. An employee cannot, a person who should be an employee cannot waive the rights or obligations that an employee otherwise has, or that an employer otherwise has. It is something that neither the employer nor the employee can necessarily control.
Right. Very good point.
Are there particular industries that are kind of more guilty of this than others?
Oh, the construction industry is rampant.
Okay.
The construction industry, we see it all the time because they hire independent contractors to come in and do certain portions of that build out or that project. And that sounds like it should work, but if that individual is solely dependent on that revenue for their operation, if they work solely for that individual on different projects, but solely on for that individual, there's an old phrase, if it looks like a duck and walks like a duck. So you really have to be cognizant. If you are the GM or if you are the employer for the organization, you absolutely have to be very, very aware of all the guidelines, because there's 714.
Depends on the regulator, really. They're different tests, but Yeah, and I agree with what Pandy said. I think construction industry is probably one of the key areas. I think landscaping and outdoor projects, particularly residential projects, companies that do that kind of work are often confusing the two. It happens sometimes in home health care. It happens in other industries as well. And it happens a lot in the trades where individuals are, have a level of skill that they possess on their own, and they may join a company or an organization, and that company or organization views them a little differently than the typical employee, but because they come into that position with some background, some skill and experience, and so they tend to misclassify them for that reason. So in the trades, the typical trades is oftentimes in our industries where you see that confusion.
And let's be careful too that we're even seeing some individuals say, "Well, but I work from home, so I have to be an independent contractor." That's not one of the indicators. That is not recognized at all as one of the qualifiers for being a 1099.
Okay.
So you really have to understand that there isn't anything wrong with being an employee. I'm not real sure. I know a couple companies where the gentleman would run out and go establish an LLC. Well, I'm a sole proprietor. But if you still aren't, even if with your little name, if you're still filling out a timesheet, if you're still accepting the pay and not able to control the compensation or the payment or your amount of profitability, you're not hitting the bullets for being a genuine contractor or independent business.
Mm-hmm. Now, I know a lot of people in the financial services world are paid, they're independent contractors with insurance companies and securities firms and that sort of thing. A lot of them have, employees also, but a lot of your insurance agents and securities sales folks, a lot of those folks are typically 1099'd.
Well, and they can oftentimes have essentially their own business, which is really what we're talking about when we talk about a 1099. An individual who is a contractor is essentially his or her own business.
Yeah. And
they construct a business entity around that, or they work a trade and they control their own profit and loss. They have business risk just like any other business would, whether they're an LLC, a corporation, or they're just a sole proprietor. They have risk and they make investments, and that's the essential hallmark of a separate business. When you're an employee, the risk is on your employer. You are paid a salary in exchange for, or a wage in exchange for the service you provide, and you don't have an investment risk. You don't have a risk of loss. And if the business doesn't do well, you still get paid because you're the employee. And so it's that difference, I think, the fundamental difference between the risk and reward proposition that is one of the hallmark differentiators between the two. It's not always easy to see. There are a lot of areas. There's a lot of work out there where it gets pretty close. You could sometimes go either way. How you classify the employee. Sorry.
And the IRS takes this very, very seriously. And notice I'm pulling in an organization that people don't normally see as being an oversight for employment law, but IRS is very much involved in this because the employer's not paying that 6% employer tax.
Right.
They want all of that, plus then the employees' taxes.
Yeah.
And so they take these kind of things very, very seriously, and they're looking at the 5500s. They're randomly going out, and quite frankly, an individual who believes that they should be an employee, because remember, if you're not an employee, you're not getting benefits, you're not participating in the 401k, you're not getting overtime. There's all sorts of things that can build up after a while. And an individual, all they have to do is just provide their name, address, and how they're getting paid, and what the role is, and the company name that they're working. It's very simple to file a complaint. They do not have to provide a bunch of paperwork. It's a phone call or an email to the division, and you've got a problem.
Yeah. So are there also issues with you hire a contractor and are you liable if they do something? Let's say, are you liable for like damages if they damage something? Or if you don't verify that they have insurance?
Well, I always worry more for the employer's sake on the individual getting damaged. I mean, the individual themselves getting injured, because remember, you're not paying workers' comp on them.
Right.
So workers' comp's not going to come in and fix that. Your liability insurance is going to come into it. So when my clients do a service agreement or a contractor agreement, I ask them to include, are they carrying their own workers' comp? Are they carrying their own liability insurance, in which that's something we probably should talk about, is that's a legal document that any company working with independent contractors should have, is a independent contractor agreement, something structured saying we're not pulling out taxes, you're responsible for this, you're responsible for that, you're going to get paid within this framework, and here's your statement of work. And that's definitely something you want an attorney to put together for you, because that's not a subject you take lightly.
No. What are some of the penalties, real quick? I mean, if you don't follow these rules, I mean, if you don't do it right, what kind of things, what can happen to you?
Well, let me start by saying I think a lot of the government regulators who look at this issue are, for the first time ever, really talking to each other. So if you have for example, the Department of Labor Wage and Hour Division come in and say you haven't been properly paying you've classified somebody as an independent contractor, should be an employee, and you haven't been properly paying them overtime or whatever it is that the wage and hour determines, that's just the beginning. What can happen then is you get penalties for failure to pay overtime, right? You then have a cascading effect, because the Department of Labor may share that information with the IRS. So now you have independent contractors you've been dealing with who should have been employees who didn't have taxes withheld from their paychecks and didn't have Social Security paid for them, an employer portion of Social Security paid for them. So now we have a tax problem. In addition to that, because you've classified them as independent contractors and not employees, you haven't paid workers' compensation premiums for those people who should have been covered by the workers' compensation system. So now you have the potential for having to go back and pay back premiums for people during the time they should have been classified as employees. It doesn't end there. You have other things as well. You have unemployment compensation.
But wait, there's more.
Yeah, but there's always more. So you see this cascading effect, and all of this because we made the determination when we brought this person on that they were contractors instead of when they should have been employees.
For all the wrong reasons.
For all wrong reasons. And Pandy's absolutely right. If you do have somebody who is properly classifiable as an independent contractor, that isn't something you do on a handshake. It is a business-to-business transaction. It is like hiring a business to perform a service for you. It's exactly the same thing. And so you treat it that way. You treat it like a business transaction. So you have a contract, you have invoices for services and payment. You track it like you would any other vendor's charges, and you deal with it on that basis. On so many levels, it's a different treatment than it would be than you would be working with your employees.
So, Pandy, just real quick, what should I, if I'm an employer, who should I consult to kind of verify that I'm making the right decision as to making them an employee or hiring them as a 1099 contractor?
Well, I mean, it's very, very simple. It's all the guidelines under the Fair Labor Standard Act. So we would go right down the guidelines for that. An independent contractor company like mine, call your labor law attorney, walk through what that individual is going to be doing for your company, how long you're going to be needing them, what kind of arrangement you've got in terms of compensation or payment. It's easy once you understand the rules. That's the catch.
The main thing, pay attention to this. Don't just,
oh my gosh,
really check into it and make sure you're making the right decision and you're setting these folks up as the right.
Because we're talking, they'll go back 3 years. They will go back and they will, this is not.
That can cause a huge problem for you.
Huge problem. So it's not something you want to get into.
Great information. Pandy Pridemore, Karl Ulrich, thank you so much for coming in and talking to us about this. This is, like you said, I think a real issue for a lot of folks. You're seeing it every single day, every week, and people need to definitely pay attention to this.
Yep.
You've been watching Business Talk, brought to you by the Sharonville Chamber of Commerce. I'm Britt Scarce with Emory Federal Credit Union, your host. Until next time, we'll see you right here on Business Talk.